One of my most favorite ways of getting excited about science and engineering is talking to scientists and engineers who are really excited about what they do. Welcome to STEMdentity Journal Club. Every month, we're going to take an article and talk to its lead author to learn more about the amazing work that they've done. Let's meet today's guest. Dr. Thomas Weber, welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited you're here. So you are currently an associate professor at University of Rochester in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences. And today for Journal Club, we're going to talk about your 2026 PNAS, or Proceedings of National Academy of Science journal article, Phosphate Scarcity Governs Methane Production in the Global Open Ocean, and this was written with two members of your group. So the first author of the paper was your grad student who has now graduated and is off to industry, which is excellent, Shengyu Wang, and then also your postdoc was second author, Hairong Zhu. So this paper attracted my attention because, people who listen might have picked up that I work in methane. I work more on terrestrial methane, mostly from oil and gas sources, trying to find and detect problems to help oil and gas be more clean, more efficient, more safe, all those good things. But I saw the words ocean methane and went, oh, shoot, there's methane from the ocean. I probably should have known that. I had a sort of sense, I know that not water produces methane, but microbes in water and such produce methane, but I hadn't really thought about it. So I immediately was very drawn into the paper. And then I discovered that you have, an entire background in this. But if we kind of start way back in time, you started your undergraduate work at the University of Leeds in geological sciences. So what got you excited in the first place about geology?
Yeah, so I took geology in high school. I don't know if you know much about the British education system, but we
Very
have
little.
this system where your last 2 years of high school, you specialize down into just three subjects. It's called your A levels. And I did physics, maths, and geology. And geology of the three was just the most fun to me. We did a lot of field work. And I always have loved the natural world, going out hiking with my family, and the fact that geology allowed me to understand the world around me. It was actually science that felt relevant to my hobbies and my outdoor passions. It just became a super interesting field to me, and so when I became ready to select a course for university, geology seemed like the obvious move. Both promising to be fun and interesting, and fun and interesting is a good combination.
I agree with that. Yeah. And for your graduate work, you transitioned over to Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences Department, UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles in America. So, what happened over your time in undergraduate to shift you? It's not that geology and atmospheric science are completely different, but they're somewhat different, right? There's differences there. So what happened to help that transition for you?
Yeah, I think they're quite different. And again, just to comment on the British education system, so American listeners can understand a little better. When we go into college in the UK, you were really just focused in on your degree program. There's none of the kind of general education requirements and breadth requirements that we have here in the States. So once I started a geology degree, I was taking just purely geology, and I was probably on a track towards graduating and becoming a petroleum geologist, basically. This is what most people in my degree program at Leeds did. And that would have most likely been my trajectory. And that seemed fine. There seemed to be a lot of money in it. But I actually got the opportunity while I was an undergraduate to do a study abroad year. I did my study abroad year in UC Santa Barbara, and going over to California and then finding myself in the US education system, I had a lot more flexibility as to what classes I took. And I just started taking a couple classes in oceanography. We were right there on the coast in Santa Barbara, and a class in climate science. And the oceanography fascinated me. The climate science kind of convinced me that maybe I didn't want to be a petroleum geologist after all. And just kind of understanding the intersection between ocean and climate, I got really interested in trying to take that further. When I went back to Leeds after that study abroad year, I had one final year of my degree in Leeds. And at that point, I was convinced of two things. One, I wanted to move back to California. And two, I wanted to kind of pursue this ocean climate intersection further. So I spent all of that year applying to PhD programs in California to do oceanography and climate science, and was lucky enough to get accepted at UCLA. And so that's where I went.
That's fascinating. I really like that, you would have just chosen something that would have been perfectly fine. And, this alternative universe, you would have been a petroleum engineer potentially, and maybe still living in the UK instead of United States and all that.
Actually, I could have well ended up living in Australia. That's where
Oh, that
a
would
lot
be
of
fun.
my colleagues at Leeds went to Australia because the kind of mining and petroleum geologist opportunities there were really blowing up at the time. So there was kind of a pipeline from British geology programs to Australian mining companies.
That's funny. I didn't know that. Yeah, I have a few contacts over in Australia, but the time zone is always the killer. It's really hard to get on the
Yes.
phone with them.
Yeah.
It's like
But
12.
yeah, I really do credit that study abroad year in Santa Barbara as like the shaping experience of my career. So I'm very grateful.
I do want to kind of double click on that because, you know, we always have choices to make and opportunities. And sometimes the opportunity might seem really overwhelming and we don't want to do it. And we take it anyways. And it either leads to, again, something life changing or, yeah, it was just a thing that happened. Do you recall when you had this opportunity? Was it something that was just a no brainer? It was like, oh, yeah, I want to do this. Or did you struggle with that decision to take the year?
It honestly just seemed like a no-brainer. It was something, it was a program that was offered to, people who had been doing well in the program so far. There were limited spaces, and they told me that I should apply to it. And then there was a few different US schools that we were partnered with. Penn State, I remember, was one, and then Santa Barbara. And I was, very drawn to the idea of moving from rainy northern England to Southern California for a little bit, just for a change of scene. So it seemed like a no-brainer, and I was, I felt kind of adventurous at that point, and it just seemed like an exciting opportunity.
Yeah, that's great. I think if I had the same opportunity, I really would have struggled. I don't know that I would have taken it, but I'm not good at like transitions that require me to be out of my comfort environment. I've been in Fort Collins since grad school, managed to have several different jobs and explore what I like to do, but within the sort of home base that I love. So I think that's, for people listening to kind of know yourself and be like, oh, if there's a no brainer, just do it. And if it's really, really challenging, is it worth the kind of stress and challenge that it comes with for the potential of a new opportunity? Everyone has to kind of make that decision for themselves, obviously.
Yeah, I think so. And with something like a study abroad year, if you embarked on that and found that you just really hated being away from home and it wasn't working for you, you would be able to leave and go back home. There would be some issues to resolve, but I definitely wouldn't have been stuck in California for a year if I didn't want to be there. But turns out I did like being there.
You did like being there, and you managed to get back to California for grad school. What was your graduate research on?
So my graduate research was on the ocean nitrogen cycle. And so when I was applying for grad schools, I was, it was really just this climate ocean nexus that I was interested in. I wasn't dead set on doing like laboratory work or field work or modeling work. And it ended up the opportunity that I was given was mostly computational modeling based. I didn't really know what that entailed at the time. I knew that it was, I didn't have any background in computer programming. I had maybe not as much background in math as I should have had to do that, but my PhD advisor really sold me on it, right? A computer model is just a great kind of artificial world for doing experiments in, for exploring hypotheses in, for kind of teasing out the mechanisms that explain data in. And I was really sold on that, that, I might not feel perfectly well prepared to be doing this PhD project using computer models. I maybe don't have the right academic background, but it sounded exciting enough to me that I just wanted to jump in. And so specifically, it was using global ocean circulation models with biogeochemical processes built into them to understand how the ocean nitrogen cycle works.
I think uh I think grad school is maybe the best opportunity, for people listening who perhaps you're in grad school or you're thinking about going to grad school. I have some students in our broader group that are graduating soon and looking for jobs and applying for jobs. And I've been trying to help them think through what types of jobs can you reasonably apply to and be qualified as at least get consideration. So when you're applying for a job, you have to meet some sort of minimum criteria, right? Like if it's a machine learning job, you probably should know how to do some machine learning. You can't just be like, I'm quite good with computers and I like the topic area, so hire me. Grad school is actually this kind of magical opportunity. I didn't realize it at the time, but I realize it now that you can walk in and have very little knowledge in the area that you're supposed to do. Hired
For
for this
sure, because more
project.
than any other job, it's implied that there's a lot of learning involved
Yeah,
before you feel ready to really do the job.
yeah, and I think it's also, but I can see it in myself looking back. Maybe you have the same experience, and I see it in some of my students where they're frustrated because they're like, I don't understand why I'm not already good at these things. And I'm like, no, no, no. It's actually, this is one of the last periods of your life where you get to dedicate most of your time to training. You can still learn new things and you should be still learning new things in your job, whatever you go off to do, but you have to have some base skill and some base productivity or whatever you want to call it of meeting company goals or organization goals while you continue to grow your skills. So yeah, I think that grad school is not really well understood. So I really appreciate having these conversations that sort of open the hood of like, you don't have to know what you're doing. You're going to learn what you're doing as long as you're willing to try.
Yeah, if you're willing to try, if you have the kind of inquiry in mind. And I think, grad school is competitive enough to get into that if you are selected into a program, you can kind of be confident that the people making the selections saw something in you that convinced them, you might not have the skill set right now, but you you have the drive and motivation to develop it.
Yeah, you'll get there. And also, if you don't absolutely love your project that you're on, you're not stuck in it for the rest of your life, right? You don't have to just do one thing. You're going to learn skills to be able to apply to a whole bunch of other fields, or other research topics, or maybe your very narrow field you can move over one. And I think that's what I see in your publication record and your what you've worked on. You've done a lot of things in ocean. You've done things in these the nitrogen cycle. You've also moved to methane. You've even taken methane and gone to terrestrial sources. I want to say maybe coal mine work is a few papers you've done recently, or methane seeps from coal. Am I getting that more or less right?
From hydrocarbon basins,
Oh, okay.
specifically, we're interested in the natural emissions from hydrocarbon basins rather than emissions associated with kind of coal mines or other anthropogenic
And just to
activity.
define hydrocarbon basins for people.
Any oil and
Okay.
gas, sedimentary basins,
Yeah.
regions where people are pumping a lot of oil and gas out of, but if we were not pumping a lot of oil and gas out of those basins, they would still be gradually leaking oil and gas towards the surface. And we're kind of interested in that, the natural process of methane seepage out of those basins.
Yeah. We're going to get to your paper pretty soon, but I have maybe one more question sort of on your background, which is you very kindly shared your CV with me before the call, and I was looking through it, and your first papers in grad school are nature papers, which for people who don't think about this very often, three major journals, Nature, Science, PNAS, which is what today's paper is in. It's not trivial to get into a nature paper. You have to normally there has to be several components. It can't just be I ran a model. It needs to be I ran a model and brought in some measurements and did integration and maybe some multidisciplinary type of work. So I lied. I actually have a couple questions around this. One is, what was it like to do these really high impact papers so early in your research career?
It was very exciting. It maybe set unrealistic expectations for what for what the rest of my career would look like. That's not to say that I haven't done other high profile papers that I'm very proud of since, but to have my first two papers in Nature, obviously it's not a regular grad school experience at all. So it maybe, you know, gave me unrealistic expectations, but mostly it was just very exciting. And I think the component that made those papers, nature papers, was that I was just very fortunate to be given a project, guided along a path, I guess, by my advisor, that tackled a really major open question in the field, and a question that there was quite a lot of active debate over. And I think that's one of the things that can kind of push a paper towards nature science. Is probably the thing that pushed the current paper we're going to discuss towards PNAS, is that a novel way to try and resolve a major ongoing debate in the field can be a high profile thing. And specifically, those early papers were about the debate over the degree of variability in the ratios in which phytoplankton need nutrients in the ocean, which then determines which nutrients end up controlling the amount of carbon sequestration by biological production in the ocean. So there was a major ongoing debate about the degree of variability in these nutrient ratios, whether that variability mattered at the global scale or whether it was just kind of something that happens within an ecosystem but kind of averages out over larger scales. And the type of model that I first learned to use in grad school ended up being a great tool for kind of addressing that question. And as as we were starting to get our first results, my advisor kind of told me, like, this could be very big, this could be very high profile. And that excited me a lot and was a major driving factor to try and just perfect those results and push towards a high profile publication. So I think because of that, I often try to push my students towards, or not push, but when I see something in what my students are doing that could potentially be high profile, I I try to push in that direction, because I have the experience that, you know, working on these high profile papers, getting the type of attention, it can be a very motivating thing in a science career.
I think that's a really good point, that's exciting, because grad school can feel long and confusing and vague, and you don't really know when you're going to graduate, and you don't really know how well you're doing most of the time. So I definitely get that motivation. The other major question I wanted to ask around this is, without knowing you as a person, being handed your CV, looking through it, what popped into my mind almost immediately was, oh, he knew from a very early point in his career that he wanted to go into a professor position, because, look at the types of papers he's publishing. He went and did a postdoc. He immediately got a faculty position after that, right? Is that true, that you sort of had from early on this clear trajectory, or did you have, ups and downs trying to decide what you were going to do once you graduated?
I don't think I ever had ups and downs deciding what I wanted to do. I think it's natural to have ups and downs, kind of self-doubt and wondering if you're going to be successful on that path. So I definitely had the ups and downs of questioning whether I was going to be successful. But in terms of what I wanted to do, I think after starting grad school and, getting these first few projects and interesting results and then working towards those papers, I think from that point on, I was definitely sold that that's what I wanted to do. Um, and it wasn't necessarily becoming a professor. It was just, I want to keep doing this forever. Basically, this type, I want to keep, pursuing questions that I'm interested in, kind of, yeah, being self-guided, not being told what to do, but, being able to choose the types of questions I'm interested in, work obsessively on things I'm interested in. And so it seemed like just the academic trajectory was the right one for me.
Yeah, makes sense. I feel like that's probably why I've come back. I have managed to land back to academia. I've managed to land in a group that operates a little bit more like a small business, which is what I did outside of grad school, is work with small businesses. So I really like that environment, that kind of, we're all pushing towards common goals, and yet we all have our niche. But I think that having your own research group is essentially running your own tiny small business, right? You have roughly 3 to 7 employees, students, postdocs, maybe a research scientist. You're keeping them funded for a period of time, and you're convincing other people that what you're doing is important enough that you should continue to get money to do it. I don't think people think about academia as a bunch of tiny small businesses, but we are. We just have, the bureaucracy of the university weighing us down ever so slightly.
I agree very much with that assessment, and that's maybe the piece of the puzzle I didn't know going through grad school, and thinking that an academic trajectory is just one where I get to keep doing what I'm doing now, which is exciting research. Kind of as you go further, you realize that your job is going to be a lot more fragmented and kind of managerial. I still do make time to, carve out my own little research projects that I'm interested in, but a lot of it is, like you said, mentoring other people to do the science, keeping them funded through writing lots of proposals, and teaching, of course, is the other main component of it as well. Um, so it becomes more fragmented, and in some respects that can be frustrating. I'm not on a day-to-day basis doing exactly the thing that I was hoping to do, just keep working on research. But when I get frustrated, I just kind of step back and think that, broadly speaking, I'm doing exactly what I wanted to do. I'm identifying questions that I think are interesting, and I'm making sure that progress is made on those questions. It's just now I'm doing it through seeking funding, selling ideas, mentoring other people to make the progress. And there's a lot of satisfaction in that as well.
I like that because you can kind of optimize on, am I getting to spend every moment of my days doing exactly what I want to do? It's really hard to do that. Or you can optimize on
Right. What job can
overall.
you really do that in?
Yeah, I don't know. I feel like there's some, but they're not very common, and you just sort of have to convince someone else that you're so valuable that they can't live without you in their environment. Um, which I find, yeah, I like the optimizing around the bigger picture, right? I agree completely. There are things in my day, emails really kick my butt. I don't enjoy them. There are always too many, and I'm trying so hard to be intentional when I open my email inbox. To If I open it, it's because I'm going to read and respond. But what happens is I open it, read, and don't respond, and then I mentally chew on it for too long. So this is a me problem, but I'm working on it.
No, I think there's always some of that. I'll open my email and just add things to the respond to pile, and the
Yep.
respond to pile grows and grows.
But you do get to do research you love. You have students doing research you love, and the paper for today, I think, falls within that. Maybe help us put it into context, because it wasn't like you just decided in, I don't know, 2024, you were going to learn a bit about ocean methane and write a cool paper about it. You have several high impact papers and probably several smaller papers. So Nature Communications 2019, Nature Geoscience 2022, Communications Earth and Environment 2025 on ocean methane. So can you comment on, you started with nitrogen. How do you move over to, maybe it's a really easy transition, maybe it's a hard transition to something like ocean methane?
Yeah, well, all of my work before 2016 was kind of broadly related to the ocean microbial carbon cycle, CO2 cycling, so that nutrients and organic matter production and decomposition, and the ocean biological carbon pump, we call it, that this big process that kind of naturally sequesters a bunch of carbon in the ocean. And that's all kind of quite separate from methane cycling in the ocean. Like you, I had not really thought about methane cycling in the ocean at all until I got this job here at University of Rochester. So I came here, and we're a relatively small earth and environmental science department. There's half of the people are on the kind of solid earth geology side, the other half kind of atmosphere and ocean side. And when I arrived here on that atmosphere and ocean side of the department, there was a lot of strength already in methane cycling. So coming into that, I thought, it would be great to collaborate with my colleagues here. That's always something I wanted to do when getting a faculty job is finding kind of collaborations within my institute. And so I thought, to do that, I probably need to get interested in this methane stuff. Um, so I started, learning from my colleagues and trying to figure out where my skill set could potentially make a difference in the open questions. And I formed a good collaboration with John Kessler, an ocean methane scientist in my department. And so the first thing I did in methane cycling was that Nature Communications paper you mentioned, which was just trying to basically trying to put a number on global methane emissions from the ocean, which it became clear to me was a part of the natural methane budget that we didn't understand very well. We know there's a lot of methane coming out of marine sediments. There's these other sources of methane in the ocean, like the paper we'll talk about in a minute. There's also a lot of sinks of methane in the ocean, and it's just really not known how much of the methane produced in the ocean bypasses these sinks and gets emitted to the atmosphere. So I did this machine learning paper that ended up getting published in Nature Communications, just trying to put the best possible number on marine methane emissions. And then from there, I got more interested in what are the processes actually producing this methane? Where does the methane come from in the first place? And it became clear there that there's very different answers to that question, whether you're talking about coastal oceans or open oceans. And out in the open ocean, there's these kind of strange microbial processes that the PNAS paper focuses on. So that was, yeah, kind of a transition to understanding the processes. And ultimately, I'm coming back to the climate science nexus. I'm interested in understanding the processes because then we can start to predict how they change in a changing climate and think about feedbacks between what humans are doing and the natural sources of greenhouse gases in the ocean.
Yeah, so through the paper itself, which I'll find the reader, phosphate scarcity governs methane production in the global open ocean. Something I quite enjoyed about it, other than understanding the word methane, which was good, because some of my papers I've read that I'm like, oh, ancient DNA and wolves. I know literally nothing about DNA, but let's do it. Your paper, the work took several key hypothesized mechanisms for methane production, as you've been talking about, and you systematically tested it through a global model. And then it's not enough to just say, we tested some mechanisms and here's the patterns of methane predicted, right? You have to actually tie it to something real. So you had measurements that I'm presuming another group took, but maybe I'm wrong there, measurements used to constrain what seems to be the most likely answer out of those mechanisms. So were these mechanisms ones that you yourself were helping discover? Were they kind of out in the community? How did you even pick which mechanisms you were going to test?
Yeah, mechanisms that were out in the community already. And maybe just can I step back a little bit and talk about the broader problem we're trying to solve? So there's been this kind of conundrum in the field for a long time. It's given the name the marine methane paradox, because it's kind of confusing that methane should be being produced in the open ocean surface waters, right? It obviously is because surface waters should really just equilibrate with the atmosphere, which means that you would expect open ocean surface waters to contain the amount of methane that you would expect just from chemical equilibrium. But these surface waters are usually supersaturated with methane, so more than you would expect from equilibrium, which then means there's methane emissions from the water to the atmosphere. And that can only happen if methane is being actively produced in the surface water. That seems like a paradox because all of the mechanisms we know of for methane production should really be anaerobic. For biological methane production, they're anaerobic processes, right? Methane is produced through decomposition of organic matter after oxygen runs out. Um, Surface ocean waters are very well oxygenated, so you've got kind of paradoxical methane production in well oxygenated waters, and this for 30 plus years now has been talked about. as a paradox. And then over the last decade, there's various solutions to the paradox that have been proposed, right? Mostly from laboratory incubation experiments. You grow microbes under various conditions, feed them various things, and people have discovered these pathways of methane production that can occur in oxygenated environments. So that data was out there of the kind of proposed mechanisms. What was not known is which of these mechanisms is most important at the global scale, which one really explains the emissions of methane from the ocean to the atmosphere. And figuring out the mechanism is really important if you want to predict how those emissions might change, right? Because they will all respond to very different changes in the marine environment. And so at the global scale, it was not known which of these is most important because it's very hard to go out and take all of the rate measurements you would need in enough places to figure out, okay, this process is happening at this rate in all of these different regions so that we know process A is more important than process B, let's say. So solving the problem just through direct measurements of rates out at sea would be a massive effort requiring, a lot of financial backing. But there already existed a lot of data for just methane concentrations out in the ocean. So a lot of cruises that have, measured methane concentration, but not the rate measurements you would need to understand where the methane came from. So our approach was to say, okay, in a model, and this is kind of going back to the types of modeling that I learned in grad school, kind of understanding that a model is a way to test all of these hypotheses and say, given the controls on each process, we we can use a model to figure out the distribution of methane that should be produced if that process was dominant. So I think in the paper we test 6 different mechanisms. Each one is controlled by a different environmental property, and therefore each mechanism would predict a very different distribution of methane in the surface ocean. So by building those different hypotheses into the model and testing them all against the data that's available, the methane concentration data, you can assess which of them is most consistent with the concentration data that we have. And that's good because there's just orders of magnitude more concentration data than direct rate measurements.
Yeah, it's maybe not lucky, but it's quite nice that for your particular system that the different mechanisms were run by different environmental properties. Because I've done modeling studies in sort of a similar vein where we have, well, it could be this, it could be that, 5 different hypotheses, but they're close enough together that you're like, well, we narrowed it down to 3, but we don't have a great sense. So give us the punchline. What was the mechanism that appeared to perform the best?
Yeah, so the environmental property that works the best. So each of these model versions kind of linked methane production to a different environmental property, and linking it to the availability of this nutrient phosphate allowed us to reproduce the data extremely well. And then you can infer from that and specifically the relationship is that methane is way more strongly produced in regions where phosphate is scarce, right? And then of all of the proposed mechanisms, you can kind of infer that it has to be a mechanism in which methane production is inhibited by the availability of phosphate or promoted under very phosphate scarce conditions. And there's only one process we know that would do that, and that's this process in which an organic compound called methylphosphonate. This is just an organic compound that's produced by phytoplankton in the ocean, little algae living in the ocean, produce this. They produce a whole suite of different organic compounds. One of them is methylphosphonate. Methylphosphonate contains phosphate inside it, as part of the long chain of this organic molecule. When dissolved phosphate in the environment is very scarce, then bacteria who are hungry for phosphate will take this methyl phosphonate molecule, chop it up to access the phosphate part of it. But in doing so, in chopping it up, they release a methane molecule along the way. Just part of the molecule that breaks off is a CH4, a methane molecule. So it's kind of an accidental release of methane as they try to grab the phosphate out of these molecules. And this is one of the things that, like I was saying, has been studied in the lab. We knew from lab results already that yes, this happens. It happens more as you lower phosphate in the cultures that you're growing the microbes in. So we knew that this is plausible, should be happening, but we didn't know that this is the thing that explains methane production and methane emissions in the ocean. But the model clearly identified it as the key mechanism that you need to explain the methane distribution.
So does this, phosphate methylphosphonate connection, does it appear to explain the marine methane paradox?
Yes, yes, it does. And yeah, we're not the first people to propose that, but I think our paper goes further than others in kind of proving that at the global scale, this is kind of why the title of our paper has "In the Global Open Ocean" in
Mm.
its title, because we knew that this happens at some locations where measurements have been made, but we didn't know that at the global scale, this is the key process producing methane. And so that was the main advance of our paper, I guess. And kind of I guess the other advance would be really quantifying the relationship between phosphate availability and methane production, because then when you know that relationship, you can make predictions about what happens as phosphate changes in the ocean.
That's really exciting. You solved the methane paradox.
Well, yeah, I would be a little more humble and say
You stood
we
on others' shoulders to continue
exactly.
to
We
solve the.
maybe laid the last brick in a big tower of work that solves the methane paradox.
How has the community been receiving the paper so far?
Really well, yeah. I've had some very complimentary messages from colleagues, and in fact, the I should shout out the editor on this paper at PNAS was David Carl, who was actually the person who back in 2008 published the very first laboratory measurements showing that methane is produced from methyl phosphonate. So it was kind of, the PNAS gets edited by members of the National Academy of Sciences. Dave Carl is on the National Academy of Sciences, and obviously it made sense for him to be the editor of this paper. And yeah, he was very complimentary about our solution and how we've contributed to the work that he essentially started. So that was very nice to get positive feedback from him.
That's really cool. I don't think I've ever really been contacted by an editor one way or another. They're like, "Yep, you did another incremental step. Good work." So that's a really beautiful not coincidence, but cycle of science that doesn't get to happen every day. So you've indicated that understanding this mechanism helps you not think about, but helps predict what could be happening in the future. So what are some of the predictions then from this paper and this mechanism in the grand scheme of climate change and everything happening right now?
Yeah, so one the main implication about really solidifying this link between phosphate availability and methane production is that we've already known from a few decades of ocean modeling, ocean biogeochemistry modeling. There's already been a relatively firm prediction in the field that one of the things that's going to change as we play out climate change over the next 100 years is that nutrients in general, including phosphate, are going to start to become scarcer in the surface ocean. And this is just a consequence of ocean warming and the way that warming impacts physical circulation in the ocean. Nutrients like phosphate are abundant in deep ocean waters, scarce in surface ocean waters because phytoplankton consume them and the organic matter sinks out into the deep ocean, right? So the surface ocean is usually relatively scarce in these with respect to these nutrients, and the supply mechanism of the nutrients from depth back up to the surface is just physical ocean circulation, overturning and mixing. As the ocean warms up, we've kind of long known that mixing and therefore the natural supply of nutrients from the depth to surface is going to slow down just because the ocean is warming from the top down, right? And fluids of different density don't like to mix with each other. So you're warming the surface ocean, increasing the density difference between the surface ocean and the deep ocean, so making it harder for the two to mix,
Mm.
right? So over the next we call that state the stratification of the ocean, the density stratification. So climate models have long predicted that over the next 100 years or so, the ocean will become more stratified, will mix less, and therefore nutrient supply will drop off. So getting this result that the phosphate scarcity seems to be what drives methane production, I immediately thought we should try and do the best job we can then of coming up with a future prediction. And that this might be the step of the paper, kind of the add-on that then made it high profile and something that would get published in PNAS rather than a more specialist marine journal, is that like I was saying before, I pushed my student to take the extra step that I thought would make this more high profile, which was doing the future prediction. So for that, we were able to just take existing predictions from climate models about how phosphate availability will change as the ocean warms up. We could take that and impose it on our model, which kind of has this nicely quantified relationship between phosphate and methane. So we can impose the phosphate change, predict a change in methane production, and therefore methane emissions to the atmosphere. And the key point that you asked me for then is that we make the prediction that over the next few hundred years of climate change and ocean warming, methane production in open ocean waters will increase about twofold. It'll double due to the reduction in phosphate.
Yeah, that is a really important piece for these bigger impact papers, is you can't just sort of say we found a thing. You have to put it into a broader context, and that's a really important
And
broad
it's
context. And
right, and it's something that as modelers we can do. So it's
yeah,
a model is a perfect test bed for making a prediction. So yeah, it was nice that we could make that prediction, and yeah, it's quite impactful. The open I should point out the open ocean, this methane source, in the broader picture of the global methane cycle, it's not the biggest source, not a huge natural source compared to things like wetlands that
mhm.
we tend to think of as the main natural methane source to the atmosphere. So it's one of the smaller sources in the natural methane budget,
But it's about
but
10%,
obviously
right?
the ocean as a whole could be around 10%. A lot of that is in the coastal ocean, where
Okay.
there's a much more direct pathway from sediments to the atmosphere, because sediments are a big methane source. The open ocean is relatively small, but I think this paper shows it's a very sensitive one. And so a relatively small source, but doubling it could still be impactful. Especially when you start to pair it with all of the other different potential feedbacks between climate and methane cycling, right? Of which many have been identified now, and if each one might look small in its own right, but if you ignore all of them, you're going to end up with a very unrealistic prediction of the future methane cycle.
Yeah, and I think there's still a lot of open questions around most natural methane sources. How are they going to shift over climate change? But indications seem to note that many of them will increase. So, while we can turn the levers around anthropogenic methane, like my type of work, if we're decreasing anthropogenic but natural is going up at the same pace, we're not worse off than we were, but we're not better off than we were. So I think that's an important note to remember when you're thinking about all of these.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So yeah, methane is often talked about as like a really low-hanging fruit in climate change mitigation, in that it has a very short residence time in the atmosphere, meaning that if we dial down human emissions, that can have a very fast impact on the atmospheric concentration. So dialing down human methane emissions are a major part of all of the climate mitigation strategies that the IPCC kind of formulates. But a lot of those future scenarios that we dream up ignore all of these potential changes to the natural methane cycle. So actually understanding how important they are is really going to help us figure out what we need to do to the human emissions control knob in order to actually come up with the change in atmospheric methane that we're looking for.
Yeah, it's really the human emissions are the low hanging fruit. You're not going to it's hard for me to imagine we're going to be able to meaningfully change the phosphate budget to turn the dial on the open ocean methane. So I
Yeah, well, people in the geoengineering field, people do talk about quite a lot about artificial fertilization of the ocean in order to stimulate phytoplankton growth and draw down CO2. I guess that could have the additional impact if you're dumping phosphate in the ocean. It could potentially have the additional impact of changing the natural methane emissions. But yeah, I don't think it's a really viable strategy to focus on. Just
true.
something that we need to be able to predict and anticipate and understand.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I see geoengineering as something a little, maybe to be much more cautious about rather than let's just tamp down our current pollution sources. Now we're changing, environments that we don't even understand fully ourselves. So we don't really know how the geoengineering solution is going to impact the entire system. But,
Yeah, we should be very cautious about them, but they're still they can be fun to think about, right? I often find
oh, yeah.
in my classes with undergrads, I find a lot of interest in geoengineering, just kind of thinking through these kind of crazy thought experiments about how we can manipulate the earth. And I think for modelers in general like that, because it's the type of idea you can only really test in a model, right? We don't have another earth we can actually experiment with. So geoengineering is kind of fun time for modelers. But yeah, any geoengineering strategy we should be very cautious about doing at scale in the real world.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens with geoengineering over the next few decades. So I found this paper as I find many of the journal club papers through Science Daily, which is just a good news outlet for interesting science results across all sorts of fields. So presumably you had to talk to a reporter at some point about this paper, and you have so many other high profile papers. I'm sure this is not the first time you've been written up, probably not the first time you've been interviewed. Many people that I work with, communication is obviously something they struggle with. They don't do it very often, they're uncomfortable with it. But I think it's so important, especially when you're moving through times where science and engineering aren't well understood by the general public, so they don't really care that much if funding goes up or down. They're like, whatever, it doesn't really impact my life, when in fact science and engineering is the basis of Western civilization at this point. Maybe that's slightly overstating it, but it's a basis, right? So what have you learned over the years in terms of communicating? You're obviously quite good at using very simple terms, communicating this in an exciting, interesting way. Tips for listeners on good science communication.
That's a good question. Yeah, I've had a few experiences interacting with reporters. Actually, for the current paper, the only person I was interviewed so far about it was at my own university press office, and then they did the work of shopping it out to these other outlets. So I think they would have tried to get Science Daily interested in it. But I guess the main thing I've learned communicating science with journalists is that ultimately you have to end up meeting them in the middle somewhere, in that they will always, journalists will always want to pick the most sensational part of the paper, right? Which in this case is, oh, climate feedback between ocean warming and methane. Could it be a runaway methane feedback? And so they will zero in on things like that and want to make everything about it. And your natural inclination as a scientist is always going to be caution, and this is an implication of the paper. It's not the main result of the paper. Can you tone down the wording on all
Mhm.
of this? And so my first few interactions with reporters on other papers, there's a lot of stages of back and forth, and with me essentially trying to get them to convert it back into cautious science language, and then wanting to push it back into more sensational journalist language. And I think that the main thing I've learned is that, yeah, you have to meet them in the middle eventually. They know their job, and know that what readers are going to be interested in. So trying to push them away from that and towards the parts of a paper that you're most interested in, or you think are most robust as a scientist, right? That could be your scientist inclination, but they probably know best as a journalist what is most readable to their audience. But you do have to be careful at toning down specific words you're not comfortable with. So I guess I've just learned to get a lot more selective in the types of battles I want to fight with them. I will no longer ask a journalist to change the entire focus of their article because they, like I said, they know their job and they know what's interesting to a reader. So instead I try to just focus on particular word choices, anything that I think, just sounds too, maybe too alarmist, maybe too sensationalist. Um, and yeah, make sure I'm just comfortable with the language, even if I would rather they had focused on other parts of the paper.
I think that's great advice. The only major experience I've had with being interviewed was I had a pretty large grant about 2 years ago, and it was a type of grant that can be easily, people can come in with their own agenda and try to push their own agenda. So what I kind of learned from that was to know where my line was. And if they were going to ask me a question that went over my line, I was just like, I'm going to retool you back over here. I'm not even going to respond to what you're asking me, because the point of our work is not to name and blame and shame. The point of our work is to help stakeholders on every sector of what we work on. So I think that's I think that's good general advice. Is just work, meet in the middle, know your line. Don't make them force you to say things you don't want to say, because that can always be taken out of context. I know that you've probably got students lining up out your door. You're very busy, but maybe just briefly to wrap this up, and this has been really excellent. I really appreciate it. What's next for your group? What are you guys working on? You mentioned you're off to a research cruise pretty soon, so maybe where are you headed off to?
Yeah, so the research cruise is actually on the Great Lakes.
Okay.
I've been at the University of Rochester for nearly 10 years now, and I've tried to mostly stay in my lane as an oceanographer during that time. But we have this giant lake system right next to each other. For anyone who doesn't know, Rochester is on the southern shore of Lake Ontario. Just draw a line opposite from Toronto. Over the other side of the lake is Rochester. Yeah, so we have these lakes, and methane happens in lakes too. Actually, freshwater systems are thought to be an even bigger source than the whole ocean of methane to the atmosphere. And we realized that a lot of the instruments that my collaborator has been developing and the modeling methods that I've been developing for ocean work would be equally applicable for measuring methane in freshwaters. And so around a year ago, we pitched a project to NSF to do full methane surveying of the Great Lakes, figuring out how much methane is being emitted, where it's coming from originally, using all of the tools we have, and that was funded. There's always already been one cruise for that project. This is the second cruise. So we'll be leaving from Duluth, Minnesota, and traversing all of the Great Lakes, ending here in Rochester.
Sounds like a lot of fun. How long is that for?
It'll be a 3-week cruise. Yeah.
Okay. And I'm terrified of ocean cruises because a lot of, bad weather, but hopefully pretty decent weather in May.
It's towards the end of the stormy season.
Okay. All right. So not
Actually,
totally out of the woods.
when we first pitched this project, we deliberately only had summer cruises on the project, and NSF reviewers told us that we needed to do a better job of characterizing seasonal
That's
variability.
fair. Yeah, I
So the
would imagine
second
that the
version,
water turning impacts
yeah,
methane production.
right. The second version had a November cruise, which was already done. I was not on that one because I was teaching, but apparently that was pretty bad. Great Lakes in November, not great. May should be a little better, and then we have August as well, which should be fine. But the trouble is the lakes will be calmer than the ocean, but you're on a much smaller boat as well, and it's like the boat size to wave size ratio that is the killer.
Well, I will continue to stay at my desk where it does not move. I have, motion sickness just thinking about it, but hopefully it goes well. And are any of your students joining you, or is it just you?
Two students, yeah, there'll be
Great.
two professors, two students. Actually, a journalist from here at University of Rochester will be coming along to capture the work we're doing. Should be a lot of fun.
Fantastic. Yeah, my group has done a very small amount on characterizing freshwater methane, so I'm excited to see what comes out of this because I feel like we didn't even scratch the surface of what's out there in the work we.
Yes. Well, next time maybe.
I'll look for your papers. That was such an interesting and gracious episode. I really appreciate Dr. Weber taking time out of his busy schedule right before a research cruise to come hang out with us, talk about his papers, talk about his journey. So interesting. I would say for me, my learn and move your feet, which is we heard a lot. Let's try to implement something today in our week, maybe in our month, is that piece about encouraging his students, just as he was encouraged as a student, to shoot for the top tier journals when you're writing, to really motivate yourself to do an excellent job. I love that. I tend to fall into these patterns of comfort. I've published in this journal before, so I'm going to publish there again. I've gone to this conference before, so I'm going to go to it again. I don't tend to punch too much above my weight class, it feels like, especially on a routine basis. So this is a nice little reminder of, you know what? It doesn't hurt. Worst that happens is you get rejected and you just go somewhere else. So maybe think about over the course of this week, or even start implementing, what is something I could shoot for a little higher than I normally do, whether it's perhaps a job application that you feel like you're not quite qualified for, or a paper submission to a journal that you feel like, I've never published there before and I don't know if I'm qualified. Again, worst thing that happens is you get rejected. It's not a big deal. Rejection is a part of life. It sucks every time, but it happens. So I love this. Learn to move your feet. There's a saying in the self-help community that makes me laugh every single time I see it, which is shoot for the moon, you'll still land amongst the stars, which is pretty funny because if we think about it for half a sec, well, the moon is a lot closer to us than the stars are. So really, if you shot for the moon and you landed in the stars, that's quite the impressive over-engineering feat that you've managed. So, here we are. Anyways, thank you for listening. As always, this podcast is not affiliated with my research and teaching roles at Colorado State University. If you have a journal article that you've written yourself or that you've read recently that you think would be really cool to have on this podcast, I'd love to hear from you. So please feel free to reach out. I'm on Instagram, STEMdentity, LinkedIn, Anna Hodshire. And if you make it all the way to the end of the episode, I always have a song of the week, and this song came across my radar recently. I've been watching Resident Alien. It's a lot of fun, and this one really popped out in one of the episodes. Hold My Hand by Sam Birchfield. It's delightful. It's a good sing-along. I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and I can't wait to talk to you next week.